So now I'd like to introduce our two guest speakers. Ara Khachatourian is the English editor of Asbaris Daily Armenian newspaper, the largest and oldest Armenian daily newspaper in the country, now celebrating its 107th year. He's been in that position since 1992. He was the media director at Rock the Vote, as well as media relations director at the Armenian National Committee of America for the Western regions. He was also one of the organizers of the March for Justice last April. Khachatourian has been covering the ongoing news about Karabakh for years and has visited the region many times. Dr. Carla Garapedian is an award-winning journalist, as well as a producer, director, and writer of films and television documentaries. Garapedian earned her doctorate in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science before working as a producer, director, and foreign correspondent based in Britain. Garapedian is the only American to anchor the famous BBC World News. She's also been a correspondent for NBC Sunrise, NBC Nightly News, and CNBC in London. She has directed and produced many documentaries, including the critically acclaimed film Screamers, looking at the recurring problem of genocide and genocide denial through the lens of the contemporary Grammy Award-winning band System of a Down. She's on the board of the Armenian Film Foundation, and among her many projects with the AFF, Garapedian has been fundamental in recording video interviews with some of the last eyewitness survivors of the Armenian genocide and making them available at the Shoah archives at USC. Please join me in welcoming Ara Khachatourian and Carla Garapedian. Actually, while they're making their way to the stage, I forgot to mention that Eric Bogosian, the playwright and author, is going to be here on October 18th, October 14th, reading from his new book, Operation Nemesis, which is a story of intrigue that happened in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. So now, Ara and Carla Garapedian.
Thank you, Claudia, and still recovering from the film. You may have noticed that the subtitles had some British spellings in the words, and that's partly because the BBC was a co-producer. And in fact, this film showed on the BBC in 2007, the same year that Screamers also showed on the BBC. So they had two films with an Armenian theme in the same season, and they got a lot of opposition, actually, in Britain itself because of that. But that's another story. What did you think, just before we get into the politics and where we are now with this conflict? What was your reaction in seeing the film, Ara?
First of all, I'd like to thank the Hammer for putting this together and for asking me to be a part of it. I think what was really critical about the film is that it does describe the component of war and peace in a really interesting manner, in that those soldiers were there protecting their homeland during war, and their commitment to it did not flail afterward, but the peacetime kind of brought its own problems. We're living in wartime right now in this country, and we hear about our soldiers returning with post-traumatic stress disorder and other issues that are impacting their daily lives. And perhaps we haven't done much to cover that aspect of the Karabakh War because it's still continuing.
And so on that point, the fact that it's still continuing, this film is based on footage from the war itself. The ceasefire was 1994. And since then, what's happened?
Well, I have to parenthetically just touch on this particular battle, which I believe was the battle to liberate Mardagerd, which was one of the most gruesome battles that Armenians lost a lot of soldiers, and it was one of the strategically important battles fought in the Karabakh War, I would say right after Shushi, which was in 1992. And it lasted for several days. It was a terrain that was very difficult to prevail, and it was happening in winter time almost. I have to say those were our heroes. Well, since the ceasefire, which was signed technically between Nagorno-Karabakh, and I'm going to continue referring to Nagorno-Karabakh in its Armenian name of Artsakh, Azerbaijan and Armenia, with Russia being a mediator, put forth a peace process that for the past 21 years is still continuing. It's being mediated by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, what is called the Minsk Group, and the co-chairing countries are the United States, France, and Russia. And negotiations have been going on, but thus far no peace agreement has been reached per se, but life in those three countries has continued, and we can touch on that maybe through the question and answer period.
So just to tell those of you who may not be familiar with this part of the world, it's a very strategic juncture, not just because it's so close to Russia, but because it is so close to a very oil-rich part of the world. And it's you've got Turkey, you've got Iran, and there is this tiny little, really a little enclave, you could almost call it, and it's right there at the crossroads of these major powers. To what extent is this a geopolitical proxy war?
I believe it's totally a geopolitical proxy war. Let's, I think, go back and say how a predominantly Armenian area, part of Armenia for that matter, fell into the whole Azerbaijani sphere of influence. And we can, of course, thank Joseph Stalin for drawing the map for that, where he and the Soviet elite at the time. And if you look at the Soviet Union map, you'll see that these ethnic areas are strategically places and predominantly other ethnic spheres of influence. And I think, and it was something that I read in the New York Times one time, that they did this strategically. So in the event when the Soviet Union broke up, it would be very difficult to reestablish a country because of these ethnic elements.
Great, okay, we're back.
So the reason that the war basically happened between Azerbaijan and Armenia was because the Soviet division of these different parts of the different countries that became part of the Soviet Union. And as I mentioned, the reaction to this, rise up for self-determination was immediately slaughter and massacre and then war. And right now, the peace process that we were talking about 20 some odd years later is trying to, in a way, be equitable to all sides involved, which I don't know whether there is any type of equity in a situation like that, but it is, as you said, part of a geopolitical power struggle, especially between the West and Russia, I could say.
So, I mean, cast your mind back to the 1985 period when we have the beginnings of glasnost, perestroika, and you have different ethnicities within the Soviet Union trying to decide what to make of all of this. You have this period, maybe 3 years to 1988, and then there's starts to happen, this feeling of wanting to have the land for themselves, the Armenians in Karabakh. And then you have the earthquake, which follows later in 1988. I remember being in London covering that. And then it seemed very rapidly this whole idea that the Soviet Union could fall apart. This is an amazing idea for all of us who grew up in the post-war generation, that something should so quickly disintegrate. And this conflict was at the beginning of it. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
It is, and actually, in discussing the Karabakh conflict, we can't forget that it very quickly became a pan-national issue for all Armenians. Armenians who had lived and grown up in the diaspora because of the Soviet Union were always yearning for their homeland and had like basically one foot in the homeland, if metaphorically speaking. So when we woke up one day and I have to say that the New York Times was the first media outlet to cover it. And when we read in the New York Times that there's something like this going on in Karabakh, we were automatically both excited, taken aback, and the movement which was sparked as a result of our people's call for self-determination and then the subsequent and immediate response of massacre pretty much kind of made us rise up. I remember I was in Massachusetts back then, and what we would do is we would fill up in vans from different points on the eastern seaboard and go to New York and protest at the United Nations Soviet mission about the unjust atrocities. And what the earthquake did, as tragic as it was, it opened up Armenia to the diaspora, and it kind of also opened up the Soviet Union, and it was the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the Iron Curtain. So I think that the role of the Armenians in the collapse of the Soviet Union is not sufficiently recognized, and unfortunately it had to happen in such a violent, both naturally and forcibly way.
Now do we have microphones available for questions? Yes, we do. So we have two actually on either aisle. We can keep talking, but before we go on, some immediate questions, thoughts about the film?
And Carla, I just want
Yes.
to let you know that we have a map of the region available if you would like us to put it on the screen.
Yeah, that would be very handy, actually. That would be
Okay.
very handy. Thank you.
Will do.
Any questions? Yes. Hold on. It's
My question was, just looking at the film, it looks like the Karabakh War was such a small operation. I mean, it didn't really give you the sense that they had commanders, generals, and strategy. It just looked a bunch of, guys from the village fighting an unseen enemy. Why was the movie made like that? Why didn't it really show the whole scope of the war?
well, I can answer the first part, and then I'll let you handle the strategic part. The filmmaker Vardan Hovhannisyan had the footage that he had filmed back in, I don't want to speak for him, but it was something in the 2004 period, and met the commissioning editor of the BBC at a meeting, a symposium in Prague, and said to him, look, I have this footage and I'm interested in making a documentary. And the BBC said, it would be interesting for us if you brought it up to date and followed through and found these men who were in that unit and tell the story of the war and Karabakh by that more personal narrative. So that's, I think, why the film was made in the way that it was made. But Ara, tell us more about, what kind of war was it? Was it as guerrilla and sort of sporadic as that looked?
It was definitely as guerrilla as it looked, although as it progressed, the formation of the Garapedin army became a reality, and where there was central command and everything else. But most of the operations, most of the people fighting the war were not enlisted soldiers. They were just like that woman who was a nurse and left her home, and to this day, apparently, she is serving in the armed forces. And that was the true story of the men, women, and children of Garapedin who woke up one day being bombarded, being attacked, and what they had to do basically was get up and, as most of the soldiers said, defend their homeland. In the beginning, when the war began, you saw some of the missiles and grenade launchers that they had. Those were things that they had collected as the enemy was losing ground. And then it was later on that the army developed and was able to actually act as a coherent army. Right now, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, Artsakh, has an armed forces that is protecting its borders 24 hours a day. It is an organized army with a commander, but back then it was really difficult to find enlisted soldiers. As you saw, one of them as a veteran of the Afghanistan conflict. You had a lot of people going in from Armenia and volunteering to fight in the Artsakh War. So it began as a makeshift situation and slowly developed into an organized army, which 20 some odd years later, Garapedien has.
Other questions? Yes. This is actually for our webcast, so people can hear you.
So, like you said, there were some soldiers that had participated in the Soviet battles in Afghanistan, but let's say you had a lot of diaspora and Armenian volunteers from Syria, Lebanon, etc., that went to fight. Can you elaborate on what steps they needed to take to go from, let's say, Beirut to the front lines? Like, what did they have to do for training, and how did they get incorporated into the trenches? And
you did have a lot of people from the Middle Eastern countries. I wouldn't say a lot. It wasn't like massive mobilization, but you did have individuals who did go and fight from Lebanon and Syria. And don't forget, most of those people were emerging from a civil war situation when they had already had some kind of training in protecting their community centers, schools, churches, et cetera, So these weren't some, I who had no army training was not going to go. I mean, I would go fight the war in Artsakh, but I would probably be underfoot more than anything else. So these people already had some kind of a military training, either part of the armed forces of those countries because it was mandatory service in those countries, or they had already been in a commando type situation when they were protecting their communities under the civil war regime.
There, many of you may be familiar with Monty Melkonyan. He came from here, yeah. Right? So LA. From LA, and there were also Armenians in Canada who went to Karabakh. So it was definitely a diasporan effort.
But I also want to focus on the diasporan effort because this really, truly is a national liberation struggle and a movement. And to this day, when you go to a completely rebuilt and revitalized Artsakh, which looks like a European capital, you do still feel the sense of that unity that emanated from this. We had people, we immediately established a fund to get important materials, medications, clothes, et cetera, and you would see people lining up outside the door. You had old people with Ziploc bags filled with coins standing behind the businessman who was there donating $1,000, and every single penny count. Everyone was part and parcel of this movement, which wasn't planned, and it also was unfortunately kind of a practice before the earthquake happened, where there was a massive mobilization of Armenians to help Armenia after the earthquake in December of 1988. So, and to this day, the issue of Artsakh and the security of Armenia and Artsakh together are one of the most critical issues that are part of the psyche of Armenians all over the world.
So it's been now, 21 years since the ceasefire. I mean, Do you have, knowing what you know, do you have any hope that the situation will change, that any one factor could, tip it towards some sort of settlement? Or will it be like Cyprus, which nobody believes is going to be solved in the short term?
3 years, it will be 30 years that this situation has arisen. As you said, there are domestic and foreign political considerations with the Karabakh issue. And the situation is so volatile right now on the front lines. The gentleman who stayed back, left his family and stayed back, was basically describing what the situation is on the ground right now, where during the war, at least they could see the fire coming at them, and they would be able to know how to build a defense. But right now, it's all snipers. The sniper attacks on the borders continue to kill soldiers, wound people, and basically continue this war. What is also very sad in this situation is the international community's response to this. There is this forced parody that, these mediators keep saying, well, both sides need to refrain from, violating the ceasefire, et cetera, where on a daily basis, the leadership in Azerbaijan, headed by its president Ilham Aliyev, pretty much declares war on Armenians. What do you do when the president gets up on national television and says Armenians are the #1 enemy of Azerbaijanis? Or we're not only going to get Nagorno-Karabakh back, we're also going to get Yerevan back. I mean, these are threats that are being made pretty much on a daily basis, if not by the president, by the foreign minister, by the defense establishment. And, I have not heard an Armenian leader of any sort saying, oh, we're going to march on Baku tomorrow, because there's a decorum that needs to be followed, and Azerbaijan is not following it. But there seems to be this insistence by, and actually especially by the United States, to be on the front lines of continuously saying that, well, both sides need to be careful. It's making the mediation process difficult. It's making it difficult for the leadership of Azerbaijan and Armenia to meet under these international circumstances. And the fact that the ceasefire was signed between Artsakh and Azerbaijan, Artsakh is not even in the negotiating process. It's as if it's a proxy to this thing where it's actually determining its own fate at the end of the day.
Right. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for movie. So my question is, as I understood, the BBC is a co-producer of the movie, and I like to understand what is the message for BBC. I mean, what is the message of this movie for BBC? Because thank you very much that you said about the president of Azerbaijan. Maybe I didn't find any information in the movie about Azerbaijan part. Maybe these words of the president we can see in subtitles in this movie as well. Because you can understand the movie and you can make some criticism about this movie when you see just one part. I didn't find anything about Azerbaijan. And what is the message for BBC which we have to take from this movie?
Well, it's a good point. I think there wasn't an intention, and I'm speaking for the filmmaker, I hope he doesn't mind me speaking for him, there wasn't an intention to show both sides. There was an intention only to show his unit, who he was with, and to follow through in a kind of more documentary style, not a current affairs news style like you would see on 60 Minutes, which is trying to give you the background and the history and all of that. Instead of that style, he was choosing a more pure documentary style of telling the story of the people he knew and what had happened to them. So you will not find that in this movie. Actually, the series that it showed on is a documentary series called Storyville on the BBC, and it's only for documentaries. It's not what you would call news and current affairs, which is a different division. This film actually showed in various documentary festivals like Tribeca, which is the festival, De Niro's festival in New York. It showed in other documentary festivals around the world. So that's neither here nor there, but it's definitely in the style of a documentary as opposed to news and current affairs, which would give you both sides and tell you more of the background.
I mean, I can see your question that it doesn't frame the issue within the larger context with history and the current situation. But I also don't think that anyone in the United States would air this movie, let's say PBS, but I wish they would. But at the same time, it puts into context the universal issue of war and peace, where there's some realities on the ground, where war sometimes. Let's look at the United States right now. We've been at war since 2001. After the 9/11 incident, 2 months later we went into Afghanistan, and then a year and a half later we went into Iraq, and it's this perpetuating war where hundreds of thousands of our soldiers have gone into combat and have returned in some kind of a fractured way. And mind you, they were not protecting their homeland, whereas these soldiers here have dropped everything. One was a math teacher, the other one was an 18-year-old high school graduate who dropped everything to protect their homeland. And I think that message of protecting your homeland come hell or high water resonates in this movie. And it's unfortunate that our soldiers right now are dealing with some of the impact of the war until today. And hopefully there are methods and there are instances where they're being taken care of. The veterans in the United States certainly aren't being taken care of. Hopefully our veterans are getting a better deal, which I don't think they are, but that's another issue.
Yes, just in the back. It's a lady. Sorry, I couldn't see. It's one or the other, or maybe not.
Hi there. My question is more of a matter of opinion, I'd say. Why do you think that there's so much, such limited coverage on what's happening currently? I mean, in terms of the media. One, with regard to what's actually happening on the front lines, and two, with regard to Aliyev's rhetoric towards Armenia and the Armenian people. I mean, if you notice, we're quick to publish some sort of article about Erdogan's spats, or his declarations of, there's no YouTube for people, there's no Twitter for my people, and all that stuff. But when it comes to Aliyev, when it comes to Azerbaijan, it's very limited. And we know that about 2 weeks ago, I'd say, a mother and child were actually injured on the front lines, but nobody really knows that here. So why do you think that is?
Well, it's a very good question. And actually, Ara and I were talking about this right before. Ara was, and I'll let him expand, but he was saying that the New York Times was covering this conflict very well and frequently up to the mid-90s, I think you said, up to probably the ceasefire. And then after the ceasefire, it was like, okay, it's done and dusted. We don't need to follow it as much. Right now, The Guardian and The Independent in Britain are tracking it, and Al Jazeera is following it, and there are other sources. Why do you think it has faded from the headlines?
I also think that the United States has a different news consumption landscape than say, Europe does. Certainly The Guardian, The Independent, Der Spiegel in Germany, Le Monde in Paris, and all Al Jazeera and Al Monitor, some of the new networks that are emerging out of the Middle East, are doing a better job covering the region because the impact of that region is more vital on the everyday lives of those countries. We here, however, feel that perhaps CNN spending 3 weeks looking for an airliner that's missing is news, or Donald Trump spewing his venom is news, which incidentally, you can look at the leading Republican candidate right now in the United States, and some of the rhetoric coming out of his mind is not so unsimilar to what Aliyev is saying to his countrymen. But let's forget about that. But there are certainly political considerations involved. The geopolitical aspect comes into the fore. Iran is the immediate neighbor to the south of both Azerbaijan and Armenia. There are considerations with the Afghanistan issue, but of late they have begun to discuss the human rights violations in Azerbaijan by the Azeri regime. And incidentally, interestingly enough, last week the European Parliament voted on limited sanctions against Baku. It wasn't because of the war per se, but it was because of finally these undemocratic principles that are being applied to everyday life are coming to the forefront, and someone's getting the attention. But I would look at the news consumption in this country as the reason why there is no coverage. But at the same time, if you cover it, if you build it, they will come. If you cover it, people will read and get informed about it.
Yeah, that's
Just the same way that the genocide wasn't being covered for all intents and purposes until, the Pope got up this year in the Vatican and, said, yeah, it is a genocide. And then all of a sudden everyone's like, yes, it's a genocide, let's do it.
I mean, it's a part of a bigger question about how world affairs are covered and how little coverage we have of Africa. There's a whole continent of huge amount of news generated every day, and yet if you look at our papers, occasionally you'll see something. And I think there's, in the case of Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, there are these old conflicts. Moldova is one of them. South Ossetia in Georgia. This is an actual war that took place, but still, there are these conflicts that have not been resolved that are basically just sort of in a state of, I guess, stasis. We don't cover them because we don't have people there covering them, and we were also talking about this, the Moscow bureaus of the major networks used to be the hub of what would cover these smaller conflicts. And now the Moscow bureau either is not there in force, or the Moscow bureau is covering Russia. It's not covering these former Soviet republics. So who's covering the former Soviet republics?
There's also economic issues involved in news coverage in the United States. A lot of these major news organizations have cut back on their international coverage of issues. That's why Carla and I were talking earlier before the film, and it was very interesting that the New York Times was giving the Karabakh issue such diligent coverage, including the Sumgait pogroms, which were followed by the Kirovabat pogroms, which were followed by the Baku pogroms, and then the Shahumian pogroms. I mean, there wasn't just one, and the New York Times was spotlighting that. But then later, after the ceasefire was signed in May of 1994, all of a sudden it just became this, as you said, it was dusted up and put on a shelf, and then they would. We now return to it every once in a while under the context of both sides were shelling each other, and this frozen conflict can't remain frozen. It needs to be resolved.
And I would just add that when an issue is not on the foreign policy agenda of the government, the administration, or for that matter, the opposition. If nobody's talking about it, then there is no incentive for journalists to report it. It shouldn't be that way around. It should be you report and then people discuss and watch this space. But if your political elites aren't talking about it and don't seem to care about it, and they do represent us, right? So if our representatives are not talking about it, then the incentive to cover it isn't there in the same way, and that is the problem for a whole range of issues.
I mean, they can't obviously cover this war as if it were their own. They're not covering Afghanistan and Iraq, and it is the United States war. But what was most egregious was when Hungary decided to return the axe murderer back to Azerbaijan, and there was pretty much no international recourse for that. I mean, imagine a similar scenario of happening these days, and the world would be up in arms. But there was absolute international silence on that breaching of all sorts of international norms. But the media coverage is always going to be there. The reality of the matter is that this conflict is still there. This issue of Karabakh survival, Artsakh survival, is still an everyday issue in the lives of people, not just who are living there, but also a good fraction of people who are residing here and elsewhere around the world. Because Andrei Sakharov, who was one of the most important Soviet dissidents, said that for Azerbaijan, the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh is a matter of prestige. For Armenians, it's a matter of life and death. And it continues to remain that, even 20 some odd years after the whole beginning of this conflict, which was started with a demonstration.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we will be outside if anybody wants to continue talking. Yes. Actually, it's the lady behind you, but maybe we could take both. Why don't you both ask, and then we'll answer.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have two quick questions. One is, what is the value of this documentary, looking at it just as a film? And also the second is there a reason why the mediators are actually delaying the process of resolving this conflict? Because maybe it benefits them for the conflict to remain rather than to be solved. So I believe that, if there's a will, there's a way. So what is the reason that, more than 2 decades, the conflict still remains? That's all. Thanks.
Okay, and let's hear the next question, and then we'll answer that.
Thank you. I noticed early in the film, I believe I heard correctly, that one of the Armenian soldiers was speaking to the other about who was on the other side, who had been injured. And he was referring to the Azeris, and he said, Turke. And I was confused. Do the Armenians in Artsakh refer to the Azeris as Turk?
Yes, they do. The simple explanation is because, it's not a secret. Both Azerbaijan and the Turkish leaders have said that they're Turkic cousins, as are the other former Soviet states that line that area. So yeah, in Armenian parlance, they are Turks.
And what about the second part of the first question, which was, is there an interest in keeping everything the same and not solving the conflict by the various parties who are mediating?
Well, if you ask them individually, they're extremely interested, and it is top foreign policy priority for the mediating countries. I get the sense that, sometimes they don't want to rock the boat. Maybe it's better that there is this continuing conflict in the region because, when in doubt, that, envelope can be opened or that window can be peered through. You know, right now, Artsakh is a democratic country. It just held its, local elections. I would say that it is a flourishing country. The first time I went was in 1997, 3 years after the ceasefire. And when you walked through the various parts of the country, including Stepanakert and Shushi, which were the main cities, you felt that you had walked into what was once a war zone. And if you go now, there has been such redevelopment of not just redeveloping the city, but restoration of historic monuments that were damaged as a result, or churches that were converted into barns during when Azerbaijanis ruled Karabakh, the restoration of Armenian monuments, churches, which are centuries old. They weren't built during the Soviet time. So you see a vibrant country. If you ask someone in Artsakh, is this going to change, their immediate answer will be no. There is absolutely no way, because you will see those characters who were still alive back in the front line.
And I'll end by answering the first part of your question, which is, is there a value as a documentary? Obviously, it's subjective. It's my personal opinion. What I can say is that for those of you who may have come to the last screening we had here, the last tightrope dancer in Armenia, that was made by the same production company, Bars Media, which this film actually started a tradition of documentary filmmaking in Armenia, at least in modern times. There's always been a tradition, but the modern documentary films, and I think it allowed a certain group of people. It gave legitimacy to them. The fact that this film was seen around the world and won awards. It gave some legitimacy to the whole notion that you could make a documentary looking inwards at, who Armenians are, who the people of Artsakh, the war, all those kinds of issues. It wasn't necessarily acceptable before to make this kind of film, so it did set a precedent. And I think also in hard times, when there is a conflict and there's nation building, sometimes films like this get lost. The idea that you let a camera run and that it's the silences which I found almost as important as what was being said, and just to see the scenery and to feel the land. That's the kind of thing a documentary can do that other formats of films, a more news or current affairs oriented film, would not be able to do. That's just my personal opinion, though. So
I also feel like documentaries like this, if they're shown to an Armenian audience, resonate differently than if they're shown, let's say, on the BBC. I think for the viewer of the BBC, who is not aware of the Artsakh situation, watching this documentary would provide some kind of a premise that they're not just fighting for the sake of fighting. There is actually some kind of history, some kind of context that has basically, empowered these people and forced them to bear arms to protect their families and to do it for the sake of their children. And when they say for the sake of their children, yes, they are talking about their individual children, but there's also a larger sense of talking about the future of their nation.
thank you, everybody, for staying with us.
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Ara.